been doing reporting called Trace over the last few months. This will go for an entire year, focusing on the response to the variety crises of 2020. This is true. Yes, Sabrina, we should make sure to look at this cutoff link.
It is, absolutely. We've been really fortunate. We have Lynette Hazelton doing the reporting for us, and she's really gone in depth into a couple of issues, but trying to get a real sense of the scope of the recovery and how things are going, and if in fact we're even in a recovery.
Which we're gonna talk about. I go to this next slide before Sabrina and I dive entirely in. So this is some data some of you might have seen. This came out of the initial reporting, led by Sabrina, as she alluded to, and Lynette. We surveyed, sent a survey to 100 of the region's most influential social services leaders, community level groups. These are philanthropy. These are people who many of you may be in the audience, may be represented in this number, but these were sources of generosities. And we had them self-assess. The questions were, how are you and the collective responding to the variety of crises of 2020? We will be doing this every 90 days, every quarter for a full year. And the idea here will be to see how do the leaders themselves think that we are doing as a collective region. And this is there's a ton of questions. You can find the full link if you go to generosity.org/project/trace. You'll find the story that has all of the data in detail. But I want to call out, this is from October 15th was when we closed out this reporting. We're basically a month from now, we'll do the next round of this. And at that point, we were feeling pretty good on our pandemic response. The Kenney administration and Wolf administrations did get credit for interacting. We saw some other divisive mayoral and governor relationships in other states. This got pretty good ratings. We navigated getting the Leah Core Center up to get ready for hospital beds. We didn't entirely need that. We felt okay about our response. We gave ourselves very low marks in progress on police reform. So Sabrina, I want to just start and say, you have been leading this reporting so far. When this came out, a few weeks ago now, it already feels quite dated, but a few weeks ago, were there any surprises for you in this initial data? And do keep, if folks have any comments, but get them in the chat. Sabrina and I will be following the chat throughout. But any initial surprise you had, Sabrina?
I was actually surprised that we got such high marks in general as a city on a number of these, including pandemic response, because we have seen, for example, that non-governmental groups from communities like the Black Doctors Consortium have formed themselves to, get testing within Black communities, something that, was not being provided either by, on a civic, by the municipality or by nonprofits. They really stepped up and filled the gap. So I was surprised by how positive the response was, because I thought that was going to be more of an issue.
Well, I think some of the feedback we also got, so this is the quantitative portion of this first round of a report card. We also got qualitative. Their leaders were able to give us feedback on how they, again, self-assess. This was meant to be how do they feel they are part of the response here. And one of the common themes we got, Sabrina, was, of course, this is very intentionally a subjective response. This is, how do I feel we are doing relative to our abilities? And that obviously is deeply subjective. How do you have too low expectations for your trade group in your own work? Do you look dimly on other cities, or do you aspire to other responses?
I do think,
you reported this, Sabrina. Yeah.
I do think that people responded to the fact that the relief funds within Philadelphia County, Delaware County, Montgomery County, Chester County, were formed very quickly by philanthropy and nonprofits. And I think that immediate response is part of the reason that there's such a positive sense about things.
And let's actually linger on that for a minute about the speed. This is something we're seeing. We're reporting both at a federal level, state and local, that we actually, by a fair bit of reporting, we did okay in the initial response. That initial wave, the first weeks, perhaps, at a local level. Let's not go too deep, but we've seemed to run out of gas. Sabrina, you and I were having a conversation, and I've gotten some really interesting feedback from a variety of folks in philanthropy in this region. In March, we saw some nerves that if the stock market was going to crash, a whole bunch of reflexive, traditional response to that. If endowments are meant to go down, giving's meant to go down. But then pretty quickly, folks, as you alluded to, got their big relief funds launched. There was some initial response. And we have seen some slowing down of that response, even as stock market has done well. Philanthropic endowments probably have outperformed. Do you think we have it in us to get another big push together, or are we not doing enough?
I think that one of the things that the reporting has reflected, for example, immediately at sort of the midpoint of the reporting so far, Lynette talked to organizations
This is
that have
Generosity
been
reporter leading this reporting project, Lynette
right.
Hilton. Yep.
Talked to organizations that have been doing food relief. And they told her at that point that the initial response had been incredible and gratifying, but they were already seeing a slowdown. And I think that that's across the board now. And one of the prescriptives they themselves told Lynette was that media attention dries up. And as media attention to these different needs dry up, so do contributions, and so do the relief efforts to address them. And so my sense is that this is one of the ways that organizations like Generosity are of value, because we're not, our attention continues to be on that, and will continue to be, but it requires more than just us, of course.
Well, and we're aiming to set up this day of conversations. We'll be having these short conversations throughout the day and then breakout groups. So all of you in attendance, you will be then put into breakout groups after each of our sessions. So we're making this as interactive as possible. But yeah, that's a common, we hear that a lot through, any year as media attention dries up. One of the ways 2020 is proving complex for every one of us at this conference is the size and severity of interwoven crises. This is almost not a question of attention drying up, but attention being so diluted across true and genuine health crisis, remarkable sustained economic crisis, a generations, centuries old question of racial inequality brought to the fore unlike never before, and one of the most controversial, contested, and still ongoing eras of partisan politics that we've ever experienced. That's a lot. And how much are you seeing in the reporting that Generosity does of the sheer just spreading, because this is food insecurity, this is homelessness, this is exacerbating existing crisis issues, this is bringing new issues. Is it a question of attention drying up or just sheerly being spread too thin?
Well, in terms of the nonprofit side, it's about being spread too thin. When you have nonprofits really working well beyond their mission just to try and get their communities fed and to deal with emergency situations, that's part of what we're experiencing. The other part that clearly we've heard of is that this is a pandemic that hits older folks, which are a big share of the volunteer core of nonprofits. And also, let's be honest, they're They're people who are usually very involved in the workings of nonprofits, whether on boards, et cetera, et cetera. So we're going to find that that's another area of overlap where we're going to feel where nonprofits are going to feel the confluence of everything that they're dealing with.
I think that's right. So today's, this half-day conference advance, we will be talking about the state of the just recovery. Just after you and I finish here in about 10 minutes, we have our conversation on just recovery. One of the themes will be, man, are we not even close to recovery? Are we still in the fall? We have how do we even begin to think about future crises? It's a touchy, tough situation that often when you're at the depths of something is when you have to at least understand that this can happen again. What can you learn from it? We'll talk about policy alleviation, what actual policies, real God's honest work is being done confronting the reality that we remain stubbornly stuck in high rates of poverty. We'll talk about taking collective action and bringing it to real policy. We'll talk about lessons that philanthropy and the private sector can learn from each other. I wonder if from those themes, what you hope to get out of today, like what are you looking for? You report on this as closely as anyone in the region, if not the country. I'm just kind of curious what you are hoping to get out of today to feel like you're more tuned into how the recovery is going.
I want a sense from the experts that have been gathered as to approaches, because you're right, we're dealing with some systemic issues here, right? We're dealing with poverty, we're dealing with the racial injustice that has prompted protests. So I look forward to hearing the ideas of those folks who are most informed in those areas, because that enables us to look at the recovery in a far more holistic way, on the path to recovery in a more holistic way.
Let's talk a bit more before we pull down this chart. We've had this as folks have joined. This is from some reporting that we at Generocity are doing. This is a self-assessment sent to 100 of the region's leaders in social services, in community groups, and the like. And this was from October, right? So this is before this next spike of the pandemic. There has been some coalition on the side of law enforcement, but I don't come with much assessment of that at this moment. Sabrina, when we do this again now, we're doing this quarterly, so we'll be doing this report card again in about a month. I'm curious what you're expecting to see. Do you think this chart changes a whole bunch if we're sitting here, in late December with the next round of readings?
I suspect it will change some, and in part it's because the city's steering committee that is dealing with sort of reconciliation has released a report. So my sense is that people will grade things differently. Of course, we'll also be dealing with the resurgence of COVID and efforts. I'm sure people from different communities, for example, the Latinx community and the Black community, will be very aware of what sort of outreach and if services have expanded to them and are more accessible. So I do expect there to be some difference. I think police reform may get a little bit better.
Interesting.
Grade.
I wasn't, Sabrina, when you started saying that sentence, I wasn't sure. I had no bet whether you were going to say you think police reform sitting at,
not
at an average score of 2 of 5.
You know why? Because we're, the horrible situation of Walter Wallace Jr. has really focused a lot of attention on the behavioral health aspect, and the city getting that alternative that they had already announced far more functional. So my sense is, depending on how quickly they respond to making that a more functional part of alternative to just simply sending the police out. We may see some improvement on the police reform side.
Talk for a minute, Sabrina. As you know, a few more folks have been joining us. We're looking at this self-assessment of sent out to 100 regional leaders that Generocity produced. Pretty crucially, when you and I were setting this up, we were very intentional about making sure this was not, what is someone else doing? How is someone else performing? But instead, we wanted to say we sent this to a group of people who we very much intentionally are saying we view you as the leader. And I think something unique about the Generosity community, and something that I bet, the 100 or so folks joining us right now, and the 400 or so who will be here today, my sense is that most of you, most of us, we can't just blame other folks. This is the group. These are the leaders. This is the people who are supposed to be doing something. And I wonder, in your own reporting, do you get that sense that folks grasp that, Sabrina? Like, do you feel a collective sense of responsibility in your sources and the folks that the Trace Project is reporting on? Is there a sense of responsibility that this crisis we are in is ours to do something about, and not a lot of
Absolutely.
folks happening? Okay,
Yes,
that's good for me.
absolutely. Although, that doesn't preclude a sense of frustration as well, right? I mean, I believe that everybody who is trying to deal with, the public health emergency feels like there could be more federal resources. There could be more help to them as organizations. But it's clear to me that at this point, the vast majority of people within the sector that we surveyed and asked to respond to these questions are seeing this as a citywide or countywide issue, and assessing it not simply from their own needs, but more broadly.
So we have a couple more minutes before we're going to have our first proper session, and then after that, we'll be putting all attendees into breakout groups to have some intensive conversation. I dropped the link in the chat for Sabrina, your recap of this first report card. In our couple minutes before we bring up Sydney and Kat for our first session, I'm curious, Sabrina, if anything inside of the band also stood out to you. Some of these other questions, just to tick through a couple of them, they include examples of, and the full questions that go to these charts are in the link that are in the chat if folks are curious. But inside of this are, making sure racial equity is included in all stakeholder conversations. We self-assess as pretty good, but deeply addressing issues of racial inequality performed pretty bad. That was in the lower end of things. So we did okay at the superficial. We self-assess as okay. Maybe that seems very logical. Didn't do okay otherwise. Didn't do really okay. Didn't self-assess as performing very well in addressing chronic issues, our existing homelessness, issues of hunger, issues of addiction, those things that have now been exacerbated. Did not self-assess as very strong. We did give ourselves some credit for responding to small business closures. There were both state and city supplements to federal response, as a lot of reporting is showing. That similarly has all dried up, and now we're like sitting back with coming into a dark winter and like not having a lot of tools left. I wonder if any other of these stood out to you as surprising or not in your reporting. Was it consistent with conversations you're having anecdotally? Any threads that were interesting to you?
Well, I think that the adapting to chronic issues is one that was very present on folks' minds when we sent the query out because of the homeless encampments. But also, I think a number of people brought up that the opioid crisis has sort of been lost in the shuffle in this. And so that clearly is an area I think that uh, requires more exploration. Interestingly, one area that is resonating right now is we asked about historical designation and sort of material culture
Mm.
and racial equity in that. And, at the moment, there's a big fight to keep the Gloria Casares mural in the neighborhood. It's one of the few murals of Latina, and of course, it has great significance for the LGBTQ community as well. So, all of these I expect, they resonate quite deeply, and I expect that we'll see that since the homeless encampment issue, to a certain extent, has been resolved in a way that was amenable to the parties involved. We'll see perhaps less focus on that on the negative side, and perhaps a little bit more attention to the historical landmark material culture question, for example.
Sabrina, my last question I get to ask you before we don't see you for another hour or so as you come to a later session. Um, uh, are you optimistic or pessimistic?
Well, it depends on the day. you know, it really does. I see reasons for optimism in the sense that I see a lot more engagement um, in real fundamental questions. The fact that, for example, all of these questions were really have a component, an overlay, are filtered through and understood within the context of racial equity is something that, in a lot of ways, I think that it is really new to us. I do experience a certain amount of pessimism, thinking that when fundamental structures are feel unstable, so when we have an election that we can't sort of feel secure about, that makes us really more reactive and surface in our response to things, and we're less likely to look at and try to address underlying issues. So
Mm.
it's a back and forth. What about you? Positive or optimistic or pessimistic?
As a rule, I'm a deeply optimistic person, but I will be frank. I don't think I've ever had as much pessimism as I've had um, this this year. I think we need to bring the collective temperature down as a rule one. As any of us know as leaders, when you at an organization have so many interwoven crises, what you have to do first and foremost is you have to bring temperature down and make decisions from there. So, Sabrina, we're going to see you a little bit later. Thank you so
Okay.
much for having an introduction conversation. We'll be seeing you a bit.